Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Monday, everybody. I wish you all a productive week ahead. We begin with an update in US Treasury Secretary Yellen's trip to China. Yesterday, Sunday, Yellen met with China's Premier Li Qiang, the most senior meeting of the 5-day trip for the senior US official. Yellen is, of course, in China to discuss a series of concerns the US has in trade and financial relations, with overcapacity as a main concern. As such, Li Qiang's words to Yellen would have been a disappointment. Li urged Washington not to politicize economic issues and to take an objective view, as well as a Marxist view, on industrial capacity, expressing, quote, "The United States should look at the capacity issue objectively and dialectically from the point of view of the market economy and from a global perspective and on the basis of economic laws." End quote. Adding, quote, "The development of China's new energy industry will make an important contribution to the global green and low-carbon transformation. We hope the US could work with China to adhere to the basic market economy norms of fair competition and open cooperation, while refraining from politicizing economic and trade issues or overstretching the concept of national security." End quote. The US Treasury Department described the conversation as frank and productive. Speaking to reporters after the meeting, Yellen expressed, quote, "While we have much to do, I believe that over the past year we've put our bilateral relationship on more stable footing." End quote. While Chinese leaders and state media have, over the last several days, pushed back against US accusations of overcapacity and dumping, Beijing knows it is a serious problem both domestically and in causing trade tensions overseas. Back in December, we remember, at a key economic conference, Beijing warned about the risks of overcapacity in some sectors as a potential drag on the economy. The European Union has launched an anti-subsidy probe into Chinese electric vehicles. As we saw earlier this week, the US, Brazil, India, and others have all launched investigations or began the process of a policy pushback against what they believe to be Chinese dumping caused by overcapacity. Quote, "The Western countries to a large extent have reached consensus to impose increasingly stringent restrictions on Chinese green energy technology and products, and they have gradually unveiled specific measures. It marks a substantial addition to the American small yard high fence tech and trade curbs, which is unlikely to be reversed." End quote. Small yard high fence is referring to Washington's technology and specifically chip restrictions. Meanwhile, closer to China, South Korea's finance minister, Choi Song-mok, has warned this week that his country needs to adapt urgently to rising competition from China. In an interview with UK-based Financial Times, Choi said that South Korea has gone from being a beneficiary of Chinese growth to an economic rival, and that his country needs to diversify its export-led economy. Quote, "Our economic relationship with China has changed. Rather than being a beneficiary of China's export boom, a rivalry has emerged over the past 10 years. We need stronger competitiveness to better compete with China. The Korean economy will face big challenges if we stick to the past growth model." End quote. The East Asian country, which witnessed an economic miracle in the second half of the 20th century, now has the lowest fertility rate in the world. Household debt levels as a proportion of gross domestic product are among the highest of any developed country, and growth slowed to 1.4% last year, though it will likely recover somewhat this year. The Financial Times writes that officials now worry that South Korea is at risk of losing its historic technological edge over China in a range of areas, in part because of a campaign by Chinese companies to accumulate South Korean expertise in critical technologies. Last year, the US overtook China as South Korea's leading export destination for the first time in more than 2 decades. Several Korean conglomerates have sharply reduced operations in China over the past decade amid falling sales, but also facing rising geopolitical tensions. In a recent report, Park Chong-hoon, head of research at Standard Chartered in Seoul, expressed, quote, "China's rise is likely to erode Korea's economic growth and competitiveness in the medium to long term." End quote. Next up, as we know, as we've been touching on in today's episode and earlier this week, overcapacity is a hot topic these days. For regular viewers, we know that the issue was long coming. We have followed how China's growth model leads to weak demand and overcapacity in building and manufacturing, and that this can lead to trade tensions we have seen boil up over these last several months. As I said we would do in yesterday's video, today we look at an excerpt from the new book, How China Works, an Introduction to China's State-Led Economic Development by Lan Xiaohuan, professor at the School of Economics at China's prestigious Fudan University in Shanghai. Professor Lan is also a research fellow at the Shanghai Institute of International Finance and Economics and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. This book is an English translation of the original Chinese version, which was published in 2021 and was a bestseller in China, selling over 1 million copies in its first year. As a Chinese published book, it is obviously going to be politically correct, but it is also very candid and, crucially, touches on the role of local government, that is, the system of local government, in overcapacity. Here we get an idea of how Chinese economists themselves are discussing this issue, and an explanation of the system behind it with case examples. So we will examine several selected excerpts from the chapter in the book which touches on this topic, which we will now quote directly. But just quickly, if you're enjoying today's episode or getting some value from it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Let's begin with the selected excerpts. In China, there are at least 3 more factors that can lead to overdevelopment of a given industry. To start with, a developing country such as China can see trends in developed countries. Certain products that become everyday items in developed countries first, such as color TVs, refrigerators, or washing machines, are surely to catch on in developing countries later. Secondly, many preferential policies and subsidies from local governments in order to attract new investment, such as cheap land and loans, are often provided during the construction phase of a project. The third reason is that local governments tend to follow industrial policies of central government. Even if a region is not suitable for a given industry, the local government may still try to invest in it because the investment would be politically correct, which would contribute to drive investment or overcapacity. Overinvestment may not always be a bad thing. In the early stage of economic development, overinvestment supported by local governments has at least 2 benefits. Firstly, local factories not only provide employment, but they also help to serve as training grounds for local workers, helping local peasants transition to industrial roles. The second benefit of overinvestment is that it increases competition. Overcapacity has made price wars a norm for many products in China. Therefore, for a long time, innovation and cost reduction was the main type of innovation pursued by Chinese companies. The advantage of a free market is that it ensures competition, and through a process of trial and error, only the fittest or best adapted companies survive. Therefore, industrial policies that are designed to support competition rather than supporting specific companies tend to be more effective at stimulating development. However, in practice, it is very difficult to avoid policies that only support specific companies. Even if an industry policy advocated by the central government is designed to target the entire industry and maintain competition among firms, when it is implemented at the regional level, it necessarily benefits specific local companies. Local governments may choose to protect local companies from bankruptcy, but if these zombie companies cannot be eliminated, then the benefits of competition will be limited, and many resources will be misallocated and wasted. This is the main reason why many economists oppose industrial policy. In China, local governments have a strong preference for big industrial projects which stimulate investment and GDP growth. These big companies employ lots of people, and it becomes much harder to allow them to go bankrupt without disrupting social stability. So local governments have strong incentives to intervene in bankruptcy cases once big companies are involved, which could lead to inefficient and unfair results. In the bankruptcy case of LDK, a former solar giant in Xinyu City in Jiangxi province, this problem is salient. By 2011, LDK became the largest contributor to Xinyu's public finances, paying 1.4 billion yuan in taxes, which was equivalent to 12% of the city's annual tax revenue. At the same time, the company created 20,000 jobs in the city. With the support of the local government, LDK received a large amount of credit from banks, far more than the total assets of the company. Starting from 2012, the company began to default on many of its debts, but local governments repeatedly injected funds into the company and helped persuade banks to rescue the company. In spite of all these efforts, the debt problem only got worse. By 2016, the total assets of LDK were valued at 13.7 billion yuan, but the total debt was as high as 51.6 billion yuan, and the company was bankrupt. However, the bankruptcy procedure was led by the local government, harming the interests of creditors. This case received a great deal of attention in media, law communities, and the financial industry at the time. If inefficient firms cannot be driven out of the market, competition would be distorted. This involves not only industrial policy but also reforms of bankruptcy and restructure laws. In essence, it requires fundamental and market-oriented reforms of the allocation of production forces. However, enforcing efficient bankruptcy procedures has been a chronic problem for China's economy. Creditor banks are reluctant to go through bankruptcy procedures because it will bring to light non-performing loans and losses. Local governments are reluctant to see firms, particularly big ones, go through bankruptcy procedures because the conflicts with unemployed workers and various creditors could be hard to control. In coastal areas of China where market economy is more developed, bankruptcy procedures are relatively easier and more transparent. However, in general, China still has a long way to go in terms of reforming its bankruptcy, liquidation, and reorganization laws. Here ends the direct quote. Some commentators argue that while this is a good explanation of the system, it doesn't go far enough in exploring the issue at hand. Quote, China's local government competition and overcapacity provides almost a definition of what the consequences are of a large and growing part of the Chinese economy operating under soft budget constraints. In fact, it is more than just a chronic problem. It's embedded in the way the economy works. As the economy must rely increasingly on non-productive investment to drive the activity needed to reach GDP growth targets, the economy reacts by shifting activity from those parts of the economy that operate under hard budget constraints to those parts that don't. In that way, the problem is not just that efficient bankruptcy procedures aren't sufficiently enforced. It is that the erosion of the role of bankruptcy is critical to the overall growth strategy, which requires a continuing shift away from hard budget constraints, and so a continuing shift to those sectors of the economy that are not subject to bankruptcy. Improving the bankruptcy process, in other words, is almost irrelevant. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Let me know what you thought about some of these developments in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great Monday, and I will see you all tomorrow.